We all know to some degree that when we don't get enough water, strange stuff happens in our bodies. This poor man, anything, right, for a bottle of water. One experience that happens when we don't get enough water is sometimes our bodies confuse our thirst for hunger. And then what happens? We eat food when we don't need to eat food. And what's that mean? Weight gain. Not good. At other times, when we don't get enough water, our bodies start to ache. And we have pain in our joints and muscles. We become tired, irritable, anxious. And that's not good, because that leads to a very bad life. What's my point? We all need water. We all need water, lots and lots of water. We're in the sermon series during the season of Lent in the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible. It's called Let My People Go. Boy, we can see there's mighty Moses, and he has authority, doesn't he, over the water. Let my people go. That's what we're calling this sermon series. And today we come to Exodus chapter 17, 1 through 7. And we want to look at these 7 verses with 6 questions, all right? So here are the questions we want to ask of Exodus 17. Who, what, where, why, how, and when? Got that? I'll repeat it. We want to dive into, pun intended, this section of the Bible that's all about water by asking who, what, where, why, how, and I'm saving the best for last. When? When? What's the point of this sermon today? We need water. Lots and lots of water. Our first question, who? Who are these players, these individuals, who is the group that we confront in Exodus chapter 17, 1 through 7? The first group, the first identity that we want to define would be Israelites. Israelites, that's the who. Israelites who had lived in Egypt generation after generation for 430 years. These generations of Israelites had not just lived in Egypt, they lived in the lower delta of the Nile River in Goshen. So they never had problems with water. They probably sang from generation to generation. Eating leeks and onions by the Nile, oh, what breath but dining out in style. They never had any problems with water. They're right by the Nile River. Even when they left Egypt, they had no problems with water. Need the water to form into walls? No problem. We can walk through the Red Sea on dry land. Need that same water to come crashing down on Pharaoh's horses and chariots. Easy as pie. That's the who. Israelites. But there's also the leader of the Israelites. Mighty, marvelous Moses. If anyone deserves the title, the wonderful wizard of waterworks, it's Moses, right? Moses, it's an Egyptian term. Moses, Moshe, it means to draw out of, you guessed it, water. When he's just a small child, he's placed into water for safety. He's drawn out of water for salvation. As a young man, he meets his soon-to-be wife named Zipporah. And Zipporah, in Exodus chapter 2, verse 17, sees Moses draw water out of a well. And this is what she says, loose translation: when it comes to drawing water, Moses is a lean, mean, green aqua machine. In chapter 15 of Exodus, verse 27, the Israelites come to bitter water, right? A place they call Mara. Mara is just the Hebrew word for bitter. And have no fear, mighty Moses is here. Moses takes a stick, throws the stick into the putrid pool, and presto, instant purified water. So if you have any water problems, who's your go-to guy? Moses. Who? Israel. And mighty, marvelous Moses. Next question. What? What's the problem? Well, this is how Exodus 17 begins. Verse 1, there was no water for the people to drink. Imagine that. 430 years, generations had lived near the Nile River. They never had this problem. But now, Houston, we've got a problem. There's no water. How many of you, show of hands, know of a town in Oklahoma called Nowata, Oklahoma? Show of hands. Oh, a couple. Okay, where's my wife? Lisa. Lisa knows Nowata. You think I'm making this up. Google it, but not now. There's a place, right? Nowata, Oklahoma. It's just a little bit east of Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Why would you name a city Nowata? That's easy. There's what? No water there. Well, Israel and Moses, they're in their own no-water place. They had left Egypt in chapter 14 of the book of Exodus. They've been in the Sinai desert now for a month. And what have they seen for a month? Rocks, sand, and dirt. Rocks, sand, and dirt. And so there's no water. We know what that feels like on a physical level. But usually physically we can just go and grab a glass of water. No, much more important, much more challenging would be different kinds of thirst, like emotional thirst. Sometimes you ever feel like you're just eating glass? That it just is cutting you up so bad? Maybe if you don't know emotional thirst, you certainly know spiritual thirst. God, if you say you're good, why do I hurt so bad? God, if you're really there, do something. God, do you really exist? So there's emotional thirst, there's spiritual thirst, there's also relational thirst, right? When it comes to love and relationships, that's where I live. No water. I've struck out on love 1 billion times. So what do you do when you're in no water? Well, this is what Moses says in verse 4 of Exodus 17. He cries out to the Lord, what should I do with these people? They're ready to stone me. These Israelites who are so thirsty, they're ready to kill Moses. They're ready to pick up stones and stone him to death. They resort to the rocks. Remember this scene from Forrest Gump? Jenny has picked up rocks on the rocky driveway and thrown these rocks repeatedly at her childhood home just outside of Greenbow, Alabama. And finally, in this picture, she is exhausted from throwing rocks. And what does Forrest Gump say? Sometimes there just aren't enough rocks. You know, usually Forrest Gump is right. Like stupid is as stupid does, and life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. But when he says sometimes there aren't enough rocks, he's wrong. Forrest Gump is dead wrong. There's always enough rocks. We thirst for love so deeply that when we don't get it, we resort to the rocks. Silent stares, verbal missiles, nuclear words, angry texts. Oh, living my life a few days, Forrest Gump. There are always enough rocks to throw at people who won't accept us. Next question. We've asked who and what. Now we ask where. Where does this happen? Exodus 17:1 says, they camped at Rephidim. Did you know that no one knows the exact location of Rephidim? Archaeologists have dug through the Sinai Peninsula. Scholars have tried to pinpoint the exact location of Rephidim, but no one knows. No one knows exactly the location of Rephidim. But you do. You really do. You can pinpoint Rephidim in your life with great accuracy, and so can I. You see, Rephidim is that place in our lives that is so burned out with fears too deep to manage, problems too heavy to carry, anxiety too much to count. Rephidim is that place, we can all pinpoint it, where that relationship is dehydrated, dry, and dead. And some people have spotted Rephidim in their homes, where the mom's ready to throw in the towel, and the kids can't find any friends, and dad's working 70 hours a week, and everyone has Rephidim on the job, right? Where it's the same old boring. And then Rephidim is in every church where, try as we might, it's still as dry as dust. At our Rephidim, we pray Psalm 42, verse 1. As the deer pants for water, so my soul pants for you, O God, for the living God. At Rephidim, we echo the anguish of Psalm 63, verse 1. O God, I earnestly seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My body longs for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. That's the where. Rephidim. Why? Why? Why do we get so emotionally, spiritually, relationally thirsty? Why do we resort to throwing rocks, verbal missiles, nuclear words? Why? 4 words. It might have been. It might have been. This is what they're saying in chapter 17, verse 3. You, the Israelites are talking to mighty Moses, you brought us up out of Egypt. If we had just stayed in Egypt, remember the Nile River, eating leeks and onions and all that kind of breath, dining out in style? If we had just stayed there, it would have been so much better. It might have been. That's living in regret and anguish and in the past. It might have been. These 4 words were made famous in 1856 by an American poet named John Greenleaf Whittier. John Greenleaf Whittier in 1856 composed a famous American poem called Maud Miller. In fact, it was such a famous poem in the day. Another American artist in the 19th century actually composed this picture of this fictional woman named Maud Miller. The poem starts out with Maud Miller, a young, attractive woman, by chance meeting a young, handsome man. But the moment passed, but after the brief encounter, each wondered what it would be like to marry the other. The poem goes on. Maud Miller and the young man marry other people. They both end up in sad marriages. Toward the end of their life, the end of the poem, they live in anguish and regret, wondering why they let that day pass so many years ago. And then John Greenleaf Whittier concludes this poem with this famous line: "Of all sad words of tongue and pen, the saddest are these, it might have been." That's the why. Anguish and deep regret. 4th question was why. 5th question, how? How? Let's get practical here. How? How can we get access to living water? How can we have this water quench our emotions, our spirits, our relationships? How can we stop throwing rocks? How? Well, I don't know. I really don't know. I guess, though, we could get a staff. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Maybe this will work, folks. Maybe we could get a staff, but can't be any ordinary run-of-the-mill Walmart, Kmart, El Cheapo kind of staff. It needs to be the staff. You know what I'm talking about. The staff that Moses uses that turns into a snake and back into a stick. The staff that Moses used to strike the mighty Nile, and folks, it turned into blood. Get that staff, the staff Moses used to part the waters of the Red Sea. Get that staff. Take it in your hand. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. And Moses did. And water flowed. And the people lived. 1,500 years later, a man named St. Paul was reading Exodus 17, 1-7, and he connected the dots. He writes about it in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 4. Paul says that this rock that was split and opened up and water gushed out, Paul says that rock is a preview of Christ. Really? Matthew understands that as well. Matthew 27, verse 29, quote, "They took a staff and put it in his right hand, and they knelt down and began to mock him, saying, 'Hail Jesus, King of the Jews.' They began to spit upon him," Matthew tells us, "and they took the staff and they began to beat him on the head." For Jesus, any old staff will do. any old stick of wood that remotely looks like a king's scepter, any El Cheapo, Walmart, Kmart stick of wood is just fine. But make sure it can't break, especially if you repeatedly use it to slap someone on the head. And make sure that this staff can be carved and have a pointed tip at the end. Because finally the rock has to be split and opened up. John tells us that that's what happened. John 19:34. One of the soldiers took a spear and thrust it into Jesus' side, and there was a sudden flow of blood and water. Water gushed forth from the one whose lips were parched and swollen. A river of life gushed forth from the one who hung in the hot Palestinian sun. A water of life gushing forth from the one who says, I thirst. Strike the rock. You with me on this? Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. And they did, and the water flowed, and we live. Do we ever? The Old Testament prophets connected the dots as well. Isaiah looks at our parched hearts and says the burning sand will become a pool. The thirsty ground, bubbling springs. Ezekiel 47. Wherever the river flows, everything will live. Joel connected the dots too. God's love is like a fountain that flows out of the Lord's house. Who? Israel and mighty Moses. What? No water. Where? Rephidim. Why? It might have been. How? How do we get this water? Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for people to drink. Jesus is the rock of ages. There's one more question, though, right? What are we missing? When? When? When does this water flow to me? When do I get access to this river of life? Or when do I have this gushing spring bubbling up in my heart? When? It's because Jesus loves you so very, very, very much that his life-giving, soul-renewing flood of love goes forth from the cross for you when? Right now. Let's stand, shall we, and celebrate it.